We're very excited and grateful to have Jannah Godlas with us today. Jannah was born in the United States and moved to Canada at the age of 20. She worked in a variety of fields, including office work and bookkeeping, as a personal care attendant for the disabled and elderly, and as a wilderness adventure tourism guide. She left the Catholic Church when she graduated from high school because it didn't offer her the relevant guidance or way of finding meaning in life. She followed an eclectic spiritual but not religious approach to life for 27 years. She embraced Islam through the doorway of Sufism because she experienced tremendous personal transformation on the path that it offered. She has studied Sufism in the Shadhiliyya Tariqah since 1997. Jannah moved back to the US in 2003 when she married Dr. Jannah Godlas, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Georgia. She completed her Bachelor of Science degree in Human Development and Family Science in 2016, and she works at the University of Georgia Owens Institute for Behavioral Research. She founded the Foundation for Unity with a mission to provide education and programming that brings together people of difference in friendship and cooperation. She has traveled with her husband throughout the Islamic world to Turkey, Morocco, Egypt, Malaysia, India, and Saudi Arabia. She's a public speaker, providing education about Islam, Sufism, and the skills of emotional intelligence. Her teaching today is on understanding Islam in today's world. Jannah, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak and such a nice introduction. And thank you for all my other friends in Minnesota for hosting us last month and inviting us both to speak. I would like to begin with the Fatiha. A'udhu billah minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amin. Thank you. So today, I wanted to talk about understanding Islam in today's world. How do we understand Islam today? Well, it's very, very complex. And really, there's many Islamic worlds that I want to talk about. I do a fair amount of public speaking about Islam, and anytime anyone asks me a question, the answer depends. It depends on who you ask, but more importantly, where they are from, where in the world they're from. So we can't speak about Islam as a monolithic, one answer religion. And since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there's no longer a central authority. And there's so many varieties of interpretations and practices and cultural customs. So it's really hard, I think especially for American converts, to get confused about which form and interpretation is legitimate and which one is correct or incorrect, which one might be incorrect. So I have been blessed to travel quite a lot through the Islamic worlds with my husband. And I've attended a lot of Islamic conferences where Dr. Godlas has been invited to speak in the United States and also abroad. And also, Dr. Godlas supervises a Fulbright program every year. And we have hosted scholars from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Jordan, Kyrgyzstan, Morocco, Nigeria, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Tunisia, Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Yemen. I'm going to talk more about that Fulbright program later. The Dr. Godlas also supervises a number of international graduate students who are studying Islamic Studies in the Department of Religion. He also takes students abroad to Morocco every year, so we get to see how the American college students react to staying in homestays in a Moroccan country with Muslim families. And also, for many years, Dr. Godlas, he still hosts the Sufis Without Borders, which is a Yahoo discussion group, but he's kind of moved his postings onto Facebook now. So every time we travel, when people find out we're going to India or Malaysia or somewhere, they'll message him and say, you know, can we meet with you? So we meet people in really fun ways all over the world. And then we get to see even more ways of interpretation, practice, and customs. So what I want to do today is share some insights that I've learned from a lot of different kinds of Muslims. And I want to begin with historical influences, and then I want to talk about some of my personal experiences. So if we go back about 200 years ago in history, this is when modernism and secularism reached the Islamic world. And so modernism was a worldview and a cultural paradigm that took the focus away from tradition and religion. Modernism values science, so was not seen, anything that was not seen was not proven, and God in the afterlife were not seen. It values individualism and personal fulfillment, personal actualization, but it's disconnected from tradition. So tradition was considered outdated, archaic, and not really valid to the newer times. So in the modernist worldview, the purpose of life is to discover who you are and what's going to bring you fulfillment. It's outwardly focused on the material world, and it greatly changed the institutions of education, society, politics, art, law, and philosophy. So all this modernism came to the Muslim world in different times in different ways. But it brought the confrontation between tradition and the modern in the Islamic world. So in the traditional Muslim institutions of social life, religion created social bonds such as the family, the village, the guilds where all the trades were learned and passed down. The local urban neighborhood is where you traded your skills and your goods. And we had, in the traditional Muslim communities, we valued hard work, honesty, frugality, and generosity. And the economics was legitimate if it was based on a morality that preserved human trust and contact between people. So this was the traditional bazaar over what became large organizations with distant managers. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was divided into nation states. So this was a foreign paradigm imposed on the Islamic world in a lot of different ways. After World War II, a lot of these states gained independence from colonialism, but their institutions were kind of still based on the European models. The government, the courts, the banks were based on British and French models. So Muslims then had to question the relationship between nationalism and Islam. So in the old traditional empire, we had an Islamic identity and you had your cultural identity, but the nation state brought kind of a very different way of looking at life. So in Turkey, for example, Ataturk modernized by imposing secularism on the people. Whereas when India got its independence, Pakistan wanted to be its own state because they were a minority. So these are very, very different ways that different parts of the Muslim world reacted to modernism, and the advent of the nation state forms of government. And then another thing that had a really big influence on the Muslim world is the oil wealth. So the oil wealth, it brought rapid industrialization and modernization, but also it brought the spread of Wahhabi Islam. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So Arab nationalism was a big force at that time, but it was manipulated by the Western powers. So the Western powers didn't allow economic development to go beyond a certain point. And so the World Bank disrupted local economies. If there was a nation that needed to borrow money for development from the World Bank, they were forced to export their national resources. They were forced to centralize their banks. They were forced to kind of impose a Western economic model that really disrupted not only the local economies, but it denied the local wisdom, and it kept the interest also kept these countries in debt that they still can never see how they can recover from. Then during the Cold War, the external powers manipulated a lot of groups through indirect financial aid to one faction and withdrawal of financial aid from another faction. This is exactly what happened in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded. The US and NATO funded the Taliban. But then the Taliban reaction to Western cultures and values invading and infecting the culture there, it became puritanical and fundamentalist. And the political activism of the oppressed Muslim populations is outwardly oriented. So again, this is the modernist outward way of looking at the world. So they wanted to reconstruct Islamic society through external legal and social means rather than through inner purification. They forgot about that part. And so this brought in a lot of the Muslim world not only indifference but opposition to Sufism. And then since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there's always been a desire for an Islamic state, and I'm talking about before ISIS used that term in recent years. But Muslims have always wanted to unify the Ummah in some way, since the loss of the Ottoman Empire and the loss of the Caliphate. But there's never been a consensus in all the Muslim countries and all the Muslim groups about what that might look like. Would it be a caliphate? Would it be sultanate, emirate? Would it be a Western democracy in an Islamic context? Would there be a commonwealth of Muslim nations? So each geopolitical region had different needs and different visions. So they've always wanted this unified Islamic state, but no real idea how to get there. But they wanted to unify the Islamic world before the Mahdi returns. And there's so many differences about how modernization and secularization influence the Muslim world. For example, a college student in a metropolitan city in Pakistan is going to be influenced completely different than a villager in the same country. And I'll talk more about that later when I talk about our Pakistani friends. So there's so many influences. I can only really attend to a few of them here. So how do we define the Islamic world? One way of defining the Islamic world is Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Suh, Dar al-Harb. So Dar al-Islam is the abode of Islam. And today that would mean where Islam rules as the majority religion. An example would be Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. Dar al-Suh is the abode of peace. And this is where Muslims are a minority, but they're allowed to practice freely. So this would be the USA, the United Kingdom, and many other places. And then the Dar al-Harb, the abode of conflict or war, is when Muslims are a majority and they struggle to practice freely. They're in conflict with the social and political environment. So this is places like China, the Rohingya, the former USSR. So they really have to go underground, or they're out and out being killed in some cases. So again, thinking about how to define the Islamic world, the digital age is connecting people in so many new ways that it's getting harder and harder to define this is this specific Islamic world and this is that specific Islamic world. It's all becoming interconnected. One scholar described Islam today as global and unbound. So he talks about globalism, social media, and displacements. All the refugees, not only for fear of safety of their life, but for economic survival and opportunity. So it's shifted Muslim identity from like a territorial bounds to movable markers of identity and loyalty. So we live in a world of nation states, and everybody has a passport and says you're a citizen of this state. But Muslims are creating their own identities that are not only defined by geography. So one friend might say, I'm an Egyptian American Muslim. Another friend might say, I'm an African American feminist Sufi Muslim. Another friend could say, I'm an Ismaili Shia, but don't confuse me with an Iranian Shia. So Muslims are claiming what they're saying, this is who I am, and they're determining that for themselves a lot, especially the youth. So another thing we see throughout the Islamic world today is really different degrees of attachment to Islam. So where Islam has been established for centuries, the practices are taken for granted. And the only differences are what we would call secondary forms of worship. And some places, the cultural practice might be pilgrimage to local shrines or a specific form of the supererogatory prayers. And anywhere you go in the world, there's local variations for languages, ethnicity, and culture. And wherever Islam spread, it didn't destroy the ethnic culture. It allowed the best of it to flower within Islam. So people kept a lot of cultural practices. One American scholar here at the University of Emory said, Islam can perfect any society if it is allowed to be practiced freely, and that includes not being practiced at all. So another really big factor influencing different ways that Islam has adapted to the modern world is colonialism, Western-style nationalism, racism, the values of secular humanism. These all created a lot of different breaks in attachment to the Muslim way of life. And then tribalism, there's a rise in tribalism, and what that means is loyalty to the tribe or the group. But the war on terror is this ambiguous thing that can never be won. Like, I don't think there will ever be people that don't resent Western influence, or it's not something that can be won. And so in the minds of Westerners, we can never really be protected. There's the fear that our government can't really ever protect us anymore. So this fear gave the rise of tribalism. And so we've seen this in the American election. It's actually tribalism, as opposed to the attitude that all Americans are brothers and sisters and we're working together to have a nice country. So the politicians manipulate this tribalism, and they really whip the flames of the fear of the other. All around the world they do this. And these extremists have the loudest voice. They get sensationalized in the media. So all the billions of Muslims around the world who are living a good, quiet, peaceful life, they just don't get any media. And so this, even those who don't practice the extremism are seeing Islamophobia on the rise. Brexit, all over the world, you see Islamophobia. So there's a large exodus of the youth from Islam. Places like Iran, many, many places. And then another very, very big influence is the Wahhabi control of the Hajj and the Saudi oil wealth. So when Saudi Arabia got the oil wealth, they were able to use all that money to allow the Wahhabis to promote one simple version of Islamic orthodoxy. And the way that was accomplished was everyone in the world comes to Mecca and Medina for the Hajj and Umrah. And before the oil wealth had that influence, the Hajj rites were practiced really differently by every culture. And there were all these different schools of thought, competing schools of thought, more than just the 5 madhabs, way more than that. There were so many different interpretations that were all considered valid. There was friendly debate. It was like, oh, wow, look how they live. Isn't that really interesting? You know, that's not what I want for me, but that's really, cool. It was all accepted. So the Wahhabis standardized the Hajj rites. They destroyed a lot of monuments and tombs. And they published their version. And so everyone who came to Hajj, the Wahhabi literature was given out. And if anybody disagreed, they said, oh, no, brother, you're in error. You have to do it this way. And so over the past 50 years, this has really accomplished a wide spread of the Wahhabi and Salafi interpretation. And it was also accomplished by the Saudi wealth, again, funding schools and institutions around the world that promoted the Salafi and Wahhabi version and withdrawing funds from anything else that didn't support that version. We know that, I forgot somebody's name. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, so another influence in the Muslim world is that in a lot of places, people are illiterate and they have not read the Quran in their own language. And they are either not encouraged or out and out prohibited from reading the Quran in their own language. We have some Afghan friends who said if the Taliban found you with a Quran that wasn't written in Arabic, they would, burn your house down or do something bad because you might misinterpret it. Now we know that reading the Quran in Arabic is a sacrament in itself that provides its own barakah and its own transmission, but not knowing what the words mean is a really a large lack of your Islamic education. So if you think of some remote village where maybe only a few of the men are literate, and the imam would be giving a khutbah in the local language, and he would be quoting many, many, many familiar things out of the Quran. One very simple example, The Quran says you can take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a life for a life. You're allowed to do that. But the very next sentence, the Imam might not say. The very next sentence says, however, if you allow God to take care of the justice in the afterlife, then there's a great reward for you. So the people who have never read the Quran in their own language don't know that second sentence that follows it. They don't know the context. And then that same Imam goes to Hajj and he gets told, no, you've got to keep your women indoors. You can't send your girls to school, or some of these extremist views. So there's so many influences. You could teach a whole course on this. And as a matter of fact, this semester, Dr. Godlas is teaching a course called Islam in the Modern World. So after I finish speaking and sharing a few personal experiences I'd like to tell you about, Dr. Godlas will join me for the question and answer part of this today. So I was only able to touch on just scratch the surface of some of the influences around the world, but I just wanted to kind of show you there's so many different ways that Islam is practiced within the same culture, within the same nation, and within the same family. So here in Athens, we have a Sufi community here. We have a zikr approximately once a month, and just about everybody has a different sheikh. So at one point we had 4 Shadhiliyya here in Athens, and one moved away. Now we have 3. There's a few Shadhiliyya beloveds in Atlanta who come to our zikrs when they can. And we have a family who study with Sheikh Ahmed Abdul Rashid, which is Naqshbandi. We have a family who study with Sheikh Afariha, Jarahi order. Sheikh Kabir Hemlimsky, the Mevlevi. We had a student who studied with Sheikh Ninawi, who you said is going to be speaking on your series. She moved away, but now Sheikh Ninawi himself is in the PhD program, getting a PhD with Dr. Godlas in his spare time. We have Ismailis who come, and they follow the Aga Khan. We have Baha'is who follow Baha'u'llah. And we have some Atlanta non-Sufis who join us. So I'd like to tell you about the FLTA program. This is Fulbright Foreign Language Teaching Assistants. And they come every year to the University of Georgia to teach their language for 1 year, mostly the less commonly taught languages. They come and teach their language for 1 year and they go home. And so they apply for this program, and they have to have been teaching English in their home country. And then this guarantees that their English is functional for them to come, be in the United States. And they have to have a master's degree in just about anything. So they arrive and they're in their late 20s, some are in their early 30s. And they also audit courses at the university. And they are, besides language teachers, they're cultural ambassadors. So Dr. Godlas has been supervising FLTAs for about 10 years. I'm sure we've had about 40, at least, Fulbrighters come through. And when they first arrive, I'm kind of their welcome wagon. I'm their mom. I help them look for apartments and take them to get their ID photo card and show them the bus routes and kind of get them through their first weeks and first months till they kind of get under their feet. And we invite them to our zikrs and our potluck dinners and canoeing on the lake and all these kind of things that we do. So it's been such a rich experience to meet all these young people from the Muslim world. So one example of the complexity of Muslim identities is, so I've met Pakistani Muslims, but I can't say I know what a Pakistani Muslim is like now, because some of these Fulbrighters have been male, some have been female, some have come from a cosmopolitan big city. Some have come from a small village. Some of the men had kind of a patriarchal kind of mindset. One gentleman was very Sufi-esque. I mean, I would give him an honorary Sufi badge because his heart was so beautiful, although he never called himself a Sufi. And we had a Shia Pakistani instructor, and she said, so they're a minority in Pakistan. She said there are Sunni mosques where there's a banner outside that says, kill a Shia, go to heaven. So we have such a variety just from one nation alone. We had Bangladeshi Fulbrighter, and when he came, his father said, promise me when you go to America, you will not lose your Islam. Promise me you will stay with the religion. Yes, Dad, I promise, I promise. So a few years ago, when the instructors arrived in August, it was Ramadan and we were having iftars. So they would arrive, they'd get off the plane, come to a hotel, and the next day they'd come to an iftar with all these American Sufis and Shias and Baha'is, and just kind of blew all their pictures right out of the water. And after maybe a week or so, this certain young man called his father and he said, Dad, no, I'm not losing my Islam. He said, I feel almost ashamed because these American Muslims take their religion, you know, more seriously than we do. I have to fast with them for the first time in my life. He was inspired to fast. So here we have Muslims who don't fast. We have Muslims who don't pray. Another Bangladeshi Muslim came, and not only are they American converts, but they're university professors who teach Islam. So they're really getting exposed to a real kind of unique slice of American culture. So one of these young men said, I'm just never would have dreamed in a million years that I would find the real Islam in America among Americans. And so he said when he went home, he wanted to go back to graduate school and study the Islamic sciences, the traditional forms of learning, theology, Quranic commentary, hadith criticism, these things. So we had a Fulbrighter from Tajikistan. And so since the fall of the Soviet Union, Central Asia has had its own kind of unique revival of Islam. And in around 2007, 2008, Salafi and Wahhabi groups were getting a really strong foothold across Tajikistan, and the government didn't want that. So they took very, very strong steps. The government banned Salafi and Wahhabi imams and mosques. They banned them altogether. Religious groups, anybody group of over 10 people had to register. You had to register with the government what your group was. Women and girls were not allowed to attend the mosque anymore. No hijab in the public school. You can't publish anything in Arabic language. Young boys cannot attend the mosque until, I don't know, I can't remember what age, it was maybe high school. And the imams are tested on their Islamic knowledge and fired if they can't pass the test. So this violates what you would call freedom of religion, but they decided we are not having extremist Islam in this country. So I thought that was very interesting to learn. And then, one moment here. We had a PhD student who wrote about the evolution of Muslim communities. And he was talking about Provo, Utah, which is a Mormon area. But what he described, I've seen in American cities as well. So at first, if there's only a handful of Muslims, they all bond together. It's us against, the non-believers or the non-Muslims. But as these Muslim communities grew, then we saw the divisions within the community. Maybe the Pakistanis wanted their own mosque, or they would divide by language. When I go to the mosque here, the women segregate by language. So what we found in Atlanta, we have Indonesian friends in Atlanta, and they were unhappy because the mosque, some of the mosques there, they felt were dominated by Arab culture, an Arab interpretation that was a little too strong. They wanted a softer version of Islam. So they couldn't afford to build a building. They couldn't afford to rent a mosque. But what they did was they formed an Indonesian Cultural Association, and they meet once a month. And then they have talks that appeal to their heart. And they have, I don't know how many people, 50, 100 people, and they all eat together and they share their discourse. They've invited Dr. Godlas to speak a couple of times. So, so I've been blessed to kind of see a lot of different things. And when these FLTAs come to the US, they notice the distinctions among them. And so no matter where you were born and raised in the world, your cultural norms are the most comfortable to you. And meeting, one year we had 7 Muslim FLTAs from 7 different countries. And no matter how you're raised, your version is right. And the people from these other Muslims from these other countries are, either a little bit wrong or a lot wrong. And it's perfectly natural that you're going to be raised with that mindset. So what we aim to impart to them is that for them not only to accept Westerners and Christians and Jews and non-believers, but also to accept all these different variations of Islam as equally valid, and to have a more friendly and accepting attitude about that. So I'm going to open the floor to questions now, and I'd just like to say that if I've made any mistakes, I ask Allah to forgive me, and I ask anyone else to feel free to correct me. And I've enjoyed sharing my personal experience with you. So we'll open the floor for questions.
So if you'd like to ask a question, just unmute yourself if you're on a computer or a smartphone, or if you're on the phone, you can hit *6.
Assalamu alaikum.
You can ask either or both of us a question.
Take your chance. This is a wonderful opportunity to have both Godlases with us.
That's great. Nobody has any questions.
We have a quiet group today.
They understand everything.
You can unmute your microphone or hit *6 if you're on a phone.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Sukina Mao from Portland, Oregon.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. I have worked for a couple of years at the local Muslim academy with some of their children. They asked me to come and support, to be kind of like the school counselor. And I have run into a lot of, I call it cultural differences, and they don't see it as being culture. They see it as just being all the same thing, and I don't quite know how to bridge that communication, because they've got young children who are trying to, their folks really want them not, as you were describing the father, not wanting their children to lose not only their Islam, but their culture that the folks have come from, but they're trying to figure out how to be okay as young people in the United States. And so they wind up almost being like young people without their own people, their own land. Do you understand what I mean? And so I've worked with some of the parents and the adults and what it's like for them. And when I talk about differences in culture, it's like they don't understand what I'm talking about. And I even had one of the school administrator telling me that, if there is such a thing, culture trumps religion. And I've been trying to build that bridge with them and find myself without words or an adequate approach. I've kept silent, and then when the head of the community is from Yemen, and he has a very tribal way of administering, where the tribal leader is responsible for everybody and needs to know everybody's business. And I told him what is given to me in confidence I can't share with him because it violates my license. And he doesn't understand that. And there's a lot of yelling, and a lot of respect means that you obey me without questioning. And so if the children ask questions, it's interpreted as them being disrespectful. And this is where I've tried to build some bridges and have been relatively unsuccessful. And I want to be respectful, and I want to be in the adab. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight in helping how to build bridges with the more traditional Muslim community who are trying to make a life for them and their families in the United States.
I agree that culture trumps religion. So wherever Islam spread in the world, we had the pre-existing Islamic culture and then the religion, they got braided together. So I guess I haven't had a lot of personal experience having a kind of extreme need to bridge it in that way. Dr. Godlas was consulted by a psychologist on the campus for understanding the cultural dimensions of a girl who was, I think, dating someone her parents didn't want her to date, or something like that. And would you like to offer something?
Sure. There's, for that specific example, we ended up writing an article and publishing it in Muslim Mental Health. I think the article is called Building Bridges, integrating family counseling with Islamic Studies. So I can get the detail, and we can forward it to the email list so that you can get that article. But basically, this has to. There is no, I think, one solution. One needs to look at each instance on a case-by-case basis, and it seemed like, from what I understand you to say, that the head of the community you felt that he had very little wiggle room to back off from his demand that his his own statements or perhaps other people's statements be accepted without question. So when you encounter that, first of all, you can't control him, so you really have yourself to work with. In the way that the therapist that I worked with on this one case talked about it, the issue then is that's brought up is what's called the self as therapist, which means, if in the current jargon, it means to work on yourself in that situation. So when you're feeling stymied by the inability of a person in a position of power who feels disrespected if his statements are questioned, immediately the first recourse that you have is to deal with your own sense of frustration or not seeing an opening between such a person in a position of power and let's say the children, is to deal with your own feelings and thoughts in the context of dhikr, in the context of your relationship to Allah, because that is our greater struggle, our greater jihad, our greater form of effort. Fortunately, to the degree that we can respond with grateful surrendering remembrance, with sips of grateful surrendering remembrance when we're in a situation like you described, facing someone, this communication gap between his interpretation of students' questions as being sign of disrespect. When you're facing a situation like that and there doesn't seem to be anywhere place to go with it, or maybe you're not sure of where to go with it, the first recourse is to take it to Allah, so to speak, and to realize that your discomfort and frustration in that situation is an ilah. It's the surface. It's the surface of actually a divine attribute, but you're not seeing the divine attribute. You're only facing the frustration and being unaware of its relationship to Allah, that it's like a gift that Allah is giving you. Your frustration combined with his inability to move and his interpreting the student's questioning as a disrespect. So our first response is to say La ilaha, in the sense of, this is not the whole picture. His inability to see questioning as a part of the educational process and the process of his students maturing and attempting to integrate traditional Islamic culture with American values and their own growth, plus your frustration and not seeing an easy way or a reasonable or clear way to resolve the situation. That is the outer dimension of a tajalli, of a divine attribute. The inner dimension of which is the ocean of rahmah, all-encompassing mercy. And so, but when we forget to respond to this tajalli, to this theophany, with sips of unconditional, grateful remembrance, then what happens is we take the outer dimension, which is our discomfort and his his inability to respond to the children without demanding respect, as interpreting their questions as disrespect, we respond to that with la ilaha, meaning it's not the whole picture. It's just the outer form of a divine attribute. And then we follow that with illallah, meaning that our frustration, his inability to see the students' questions as a natural process of education, all of that is encompassed by the ocean of unity, by the ocean of rahmah. And so by taking refuge in this dhikr, the remembrance of Allah, which is really, in fact, Allah's gift to us, what Allah is giving you when you encounter this administrator in that kind of position, and your feelings, the feelings that you have, that's all a gift, the outer surface of which is the wrapping, the discomfort and the his and the children's frustration as well. All of that is the wrapping of the gift. When we receive it, when we respond to it with La ilaha illallah in that way, remembering that the wrapper is not the whole picture, La ilaha, and that the whole picture is all-encompassing, merciful ocean of Allah's love, then we unwrap, we increase the likelihood that we will get to the jewel inside of the wrapping, inside of the box. And the more we do that, the more we make that our greater form of effort, then it increases the likelihood that we'll be able to see beyond the conditioned responses of our nafs, which to either retreat, to want to retreat in flight from our discomfort, or from maybe we're upset we might get upset at such a situation. Whatever our response, whether it's a variation of fight or flight, that's the nafs. And that keeps us, that conditioning keeps us keeps our awareness limited to those types of fight or flight solutions, which limits our ability to see wise, out of the box solutions to that kind of situation. But fortunately, the more we take refuge in the greater jihad, the greater form of effort, which, as I described, then that will increase our freedom from the conditioning of being in the chains, the perceptual chains of our nafs, and increase the likelihood that we'll be able to see wise solutions to such what are often an intractable problem. So that's my long-winded answer.
Thank you. I actually spent 2 years without speaking up in any way, doing tauba for every time, as you were talking about, every time I ran into reaction in myself. It wasn't easy for me to witness how sometimes the children were treated, particularly the high schoolers, who developmentally are going through a stage of trying to establish what's their own. And I did a lot of washing in the way that you said. I didn't, but what I'm hearing from you is using the dhikr la ilaha illallah. And that is I did mostly tauba, and a lot of praying, and a lot of, washing my own reactions to stuff. I still was not left with not knowing how to build a bridge. Other than politely at one point saying that because they were being critical of me because I was not yelling at the kids. They told me I was not demanding respect. The problem is I could walk into a 6th grade class and the kids immediately turned around and were totally silent and facing forward with me. And I asked them once why they treated me that way. And I saw some very disrespectful behavior towards their teachers. And they said, because I was told because I respect them. I respect the 6th graders. And so I tried to share how modeling for the kids like that could be really helpful. But I tried to do it gently, and I just didn't know how to. It's like I didn't speak the right language or whatever. And so I just didn't know how to bridge what felt like to me was a cultural gap. And they didn't have a way to tease that apart from what I was trying to teach. So I even tried to teach the kids Tauba, and out of the 6th and 7th grade class, which was about 40 students, only 2 of them knew what Tauba was. So I was like, I didn't know where to go with that. So, but thank you. I'm left with loving these people, loving their hearts. I can't tell you, their hearts are so beautiful. I just am baffled with knowing how to bridge the culture. So, but thank you for your feedback.
You're welcome. Do you have anything you want to add? Because there's something I could add.
You go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, the doing in that kind of situation doesn't guarantee that you would come up with a solution. It just increases the likelihood that the obstacles to finding a solution obstacles that come from your own conditioned reactions of your ego, it increases the likelihood that you will be less in reaction and therefore be more open to seeing possible out-of-the-box solutions. But that the solution you came up with of doing Tauba, and then listening, observing that they were more respectful to you, and then asking them what's going on, it seemed to me like a kind of out-of-the-box solution. But certainly another possibility in that kind of situation would be to have the teachers be students for a day, or at least in a kind of role-playing way, or at least for an hour, and the students to be in the teacher's position. That would be one way to try to get each other into the other's shoes, so to speak. Eventually, of course, beyond the adolescent stage, and what we're hoping for is where the students would learn the teacher's language of love, and the students would learn the students would learn the teacher's language of love, and the teachers would learn the students' language of love, and realize that in order for, in any kind of a conflict situation, one of the ways to help resolve the conflict is to first of all to understand that what one imagines to the other to be looking for may be in a somewhat different language or means that you're used to understanding. In other words, I'll give an example. In my own situation, it took way beyond adolescence for me to understand that if I just spoke to my father about the stock market and asked him how his stocks were doing, he understood that as I love you. So,
Before that,
but it took many years, and me being an adolescent in many ways, expecting love in the way that I wanted to hear love, and me trying to communicate love in the way that I would best receive love. Finally, I realized, well, I need to start listening to the language in which my father can receive love. And when I understood that, then I was able to learn his language. Unfortunately, adolescents, they would have to be saints practically to recognize that their teachers or that administrator, for example, they're in demanding respect, that's and not questioning, that's what love means to them. And it's hard for when it's almost impossible to expect adolescents to grasp that that if their teachers and administrators don't if their teachers and administrators interpret their questioning as not loving, not respecting, it's very difficult to ask an adolescent to transcend that. So perhaps the best, one possible solution is is for you to be the interpreter of love. One last thing that hopefully that might shed some light on it is that in the world today, where people are looking for leverage to solve problems, but what we need to do is to see ourselves to create leverage rather than leverage. And so when you recognize that both the adolescents and the administrators, they're looking for love, respect being a form of love. And if you can, to the degree that you yourself can see that these are two star-crossed lovers in roles of teacher and student, one demanding love in the form of being able to question, and the other demanding love in the form of respect, this might help you to be a kind of matchmaker between this odd couple. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your input.
You're welcome.
Thank you. If there's someone else that would like to ask a question, we're a little bit beyond our time, but we could probably take a few minutes if there's somebody else. Unmute yourself, hit *6 if you're on a phone.
Okay, go ahead. I just wanted to comment from Minneapolis that I worked in Egypt for a while. And because they have Christians and Muslims in their country, and you're working with both of them, they're very clear on what is Egyptian versus what is Muslim or Christian. And so they're very, very aware of that. And so it's an interesting contrast to what you were describing, where people couldn't separate culture from religion. And because I was always saying, is this Islam? And they'd say, it's Egyptian, and so I was always being straightened out. So I think that countries that may be more plural in their religions or plural in the way that they live their lives may be able to separate those two better than these smaller countries that it's all stuck together.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to ask a final question before we let Dr. Godlas and Jannah Godlas go? If not, Jannah, I'm going to thank you for a beautiful teaching today. And Dr. Godlas, I want to thank you for joining us for the question and answer period. It is very much appreciated. And the wisdom that you both bring to our community is very much felt and deeply, deeply appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you to the Minnesota community for making all these talks available to everyone.
Thank you.